Name's William B. Cochran, and I was born in Kyle, Texas, uh, on December 18th, 1930, which is a long time ago. And I'm 79 years old, and I've lived in Hays County just the biggest part of my life, about 80 or 90% of it. So I've had, in other words, it's been my address for at least the last 60 years anyway. I was born at home with Dr. Lauderdale. He was wasn't born in a hospital, and when I got ready to go into the Army, my mother didn't have a birth certificate, so we had to go find a birth certificate to prove that I was born, and it was kind of funny, you know. But then I was drafted into the Army back in 1950, and you know, so that's been quite a while ago. And like I said, in those days, most people were born at home. I think all my family was born at home. My dad was James Hezekiah Cochran, and my mother was Beatrice Amanda Cochran. I believe they all come out of Tennessee. They come from Tennessee to Texas. But my dad only had about an 8th grade education. His mother died when he was young, and they had 5 kids, and he had to quit school to help support the children. Well, Grandma Wimberley, they settled the little town of Wimberley, Texas. Pleasant Wimberley was her father. Well, my grandmother Wimberley, she was probably in her 80s or 90s, and before she died, she came and lived with our family for about 5 months, and she would tell me stories about the Cochrans and about the Wimberleys, and you know the good old days, as some people call them. They weren't very good, according to Grandma Wimberley. And she told me stories about the Indians and that she had heard from her mother, and they were also from Tennessee. They migrated from Tennessee into Texas, and so she told me a lot of stories about the Indians and settling up Wimberley and the mill race there in Wimberley, and when they opened the grist mill there in Wimberley. So she told me some stories about that and how they had to redo the mill, and she was really an interesting person to talk to. I had 4 brothers and 4 sisters, and there was Geraldine, Maggie, Hazy, and Bootsy, and there was Pug, Doc, Claude, and me. So I had the 4 brothers and 4 sisters. Come from a large family. And my grandmother Wimberley, she had 15 in her family, so I had a lot of uncles and aunts, on that side of the family. My mother wrote a lot of poetry. She wrote some about when the Koreans took over the Navy ship, the Pueblo. She wrote a poem about that, and it was published in the, I believe, the San Antonio Light. And she had wrote quite a few poems and quite a few songs, and she was really gifted at things like that, writing poetry. And I used to sit up at night, while she was writing her poetry. And the first home that I remember living in, I was born in the Kyle, just right outside of Kyle. The little community was called Goforth. And I was 6 years old when I started to school there in Kyle. And then later on I went to school in Kyle. But that's about the only town or only place we went to was Kyle in those days. Because everywhere you went, it was horse and buggy or a wagon, or I guess some people had cars, but we didn't have one. So, and my dad worked for the bank there in Kyle, and for several years. Well, in the Yeah, I went to the second grade in Kyle there, and I remember, the old school is still there. We went to school in a little tiny building. It's still there in Kyle. It's only about maybe 30 by 40, I guess. The old building's still standing there, and we went to school in that little building. I think we had five grades in the one building, and I'm trying to think. He went from the first to no, it went from the first to the seventh grade there, and it was about 17 students in our classroom. Well, we didn't have too much time for play. It was mostly work and go to school, and it was just we had a real small playground with a merry-go-round, and that was just about the size of it for recess and what have you. You go outside the merry-go-round, and I think we did have a swing, and that was it. Oh yes, they disciplined. You didn't bring up your lessons, and you didn't stay up. Those teachers got hard with you in those days. They whop you with a ruler, or they get your attention, especially if you dozed off in school. Now that was bad news. We usually, when we got home, we took off our school clothes, put on our work clothes, and we went to the field. Usually I guess in June, July, where we'd go to my dad, we grew cotton and corn, and we'd come in the afternoon, take off our clothes, and pick cotton till almost dark. Then we would come in and milk about 5 cows, and of course we fed all the animals around the place, and we didn't really have much time to, for pleasure or for fun. About our only time we had any fun was on Sunday, because we worked every day except Sunday. My dad always made sure we took off on Sunday. We went to church, and Sunday was our greatest day. We had time to eat and to rest and to find a place to go swimming. Sometimes it was just in an old mud tank, but at least we had a little recreation. And we had all days, Sunday, and it was really and we had time to go visit with our friends, and had our friends to come over, and like I say, Sunday was our best day.
Did you eat a special meal on Sunday?
Sunday, if we were lucky, we had chicken on Sunday, and Mother always cooked biscuits and chicken and cornbread, and you'd always invited at least 1 or 2 neighbors over, for Sunday dinner, and occasionally the preacher would come over for Sunday dinner. But that was just our best day, because we really needed to rest. We really worked hard. We didn't have much time for play. He worked for the bank. He was as he worked for the bank, he was a collection agency for the bank. He'd go to, if people couldn't pay their rent or pay their bank note, they'd put up their horses or their mules as collateral for their note. And if they didn't pay the note, he'd have to go out and take their horses or their wagon or whatever they put up. And like he told me a lot of times, if you didn't have a wagon and some mules to work the land, you were in terrible shape. So a lot of times he would tell the bank, he'd go out to pick up the horses, and he'd tell them, I just couldn't catch them. It was, because that was the only way they had to make a living, was something to plow the land with and to grow their crops. And if they took those away, the family had no way of making a living. So a lot of times he would tell the bank, I just couldn't catch the horses, and he'd go back, and then of course if they couldn't catch them, then the bank would write it off. And he said they were really tough times in those days. We had the old saying that we had 3 meals a day. Had oatmeal, cornmeal, and missa meal. And that was pretty well true. In other words, we lived on just whatever we could grow or whatever we planted, And but we always had meat. We had hogs and what have you. We never actually went hungry, but it wasn't the best of times, I'll tell you for sure. I had 4 brothers that served in the military, 2 in the Army, 1 in the Navy, and 1 in the Air Force. And one brother spent 4 years in Germany, in in during World War II, and the other one was in the medics here in the States. And James spent 4 years on Guam, and Claude spent 2 years in the Navy. And he was at when the Japanese surrendered. He was on one of the ships when the Japanese surrendered to the Americans. We had rationing for shoes, rationing for tires for your car, rationing for sugar, rationing for coffee. And being in a large family, it was real difficult because we couldn't get. And a lot of times, even if we did have the stamp to get the stuff with, we didn't have the money to buy with. So it was, and all my brothers was in the service, so, and my sisters were married and gone, so I was the only one at home during the war years. The only communication we'd get from our brothers was we'd get a letter. It was always censored, a real small letter, and just every now and then. The mail wasn't too good back in those days. But sometimes on the weekends in the winter time, we had what we called house dances. We would all gather together at someone's house, and everybody played guitars and fiddles and what have you, and we'd just all have a get together. And one uncle of mine, he had a band, and he would just go from house to house. We always had it at a different place, but we'd always had our house dances, and they were really enjoyable. Of course, I was awful young, and what I remember, our greatest time was coming to Camp Ben McCullough up here for the reunion at Camp Ben McCullough. We'd get in a wagon and come up and spend a week at Camp Ben McCullough here close to Dripping. And that was a wonderful time for us. Well, my mother and dad, they were religious people. They believed in going to church, but my dad and mom mostly taught us the golden rule, to do unto others, and they really they weren't real hard people to get along with. They could. Or if you had a problem, you went to them, they'd help you solve it, and they were just wonderful parents. They just couldn't have been any better. We had a radio during the 30s, a battery radio, and about all we could really listen to was the news, because I had 4 brothers in the war, and we would listen to the news report, and that was just about it. We had little time to listen to music, and I remember some of the old radio shows like Stella Dallas and As the World Turns, and those old and we'd listen to some of those on radio. Yes, I sure do. I remember listening to the president when when they bombed Tokyo. That was and then as the war was progressing over, when it got close to the end of the war, we listened to the news almost every day. Because my mother had 4 boys, in the war, and when Korea come along, she was upset because I had to go they drafted me, and I was drafted in 1950. There in Martin. No, I believe we were living in San Marcos. And then we moved to Martindale, and they drafted me, and then I went up to Fort Hood, took my basic at Fort Hood, and in 6 weeks, they shipped me from Fort Hood right on over to Korea. So I didn't get to spend much time in the States. It was just, they were really needing some people over there. Only made one phone call from Japan, and I think it was $50 a minute, It was two-way radio phone call from Japan over here. And my granddaughter's husband just came back from Korea about a year ago. He called home every day. And I got one phone call from Japan when I went on R&R back to the States, and I think it was $300 or $400 for that one phone call. I started playing. My mother played the guitar, and I started playing the guitar probably when I was about 5 years old. And I went on after I got out of the Army and come back from Korea in 1951. Well, I had a small band. It was called the Lariats, and we played some of the local clubs, and like Gill's Club in Austin, and some of the clubs there in Ulan, and we played Club 21, and so I kind of got into that and really enjoyed it. And later on in years, well, I went with Willie Nelson's dad a few times where they were playing, and played some music with them, and I really enjoyed that. And right up until Pop Nelson died. After he died, well, you know, I never did play with him anymore after that. Well, when I first came back from Korea, I went to work for Brown Schools in San Marcos as the maintenance director up there. And I worked for them for several years. Mentally retarded children. And we had 3 units there in San Marcos. And it was just, you know, for the children with Down syndrome. And after that, I went into the paint contracting business and was doing some federal contracts, you know, all over the state. I did some federal work up at Lackland and let's see, Fort Hood. I did some up there. It was just mostly, you know, contracts for the government. I think the first construction job I went on was over at El Rancho Sima. That was a Boy Scout camp for Hays County. And I said I'd never eat another lunch on the ground after I come back from Korea. And the first thing you did, went over and went to work. We had to take our lunch every day. Let me tell you a little bit about San Marcos. San Marcos had one theater, had one hot dog stand, and had one hamburger stand. And I was trying to think. Yeah, the one, no drive-in. And you knew everyone in town. When you walked down the street, you knew everyone. Just 99.9% of the people, you knew them personally. And the only, most of the income from San Marcos was from the academy. In fact, I worked for the academy for a while, and but it was such a small town, and the fish hatchery down there, when Lyndon Johnson became president, he gave the fish hatchery to the college down where the old Stick Beach building is.